If I thought about Paris and Haussmann's Paris, 8 to 10 stories of boulevards and beautiful courtyard orientated development, I can look up, I can see the sky, it doesn't feel dense. And yet when I'm in Hong Kong, in a district called Tsim Sha Tsui, where you've got 20-story skyscrapers and I can't see the sky because it's all so tight, it feels very dense. And yet, this Haussmann's Paris is denser than 20-story Tsim Sha Tsui in Hong Kong. And it's all about the perceived density. It's because we can't see the sky. That's why we think it's so dense. So that led me on a journey to think about how sky courts, sky gardens can be an added element within our urban vocabulary to shape spaces that feel less dense.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipp, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Jason Pomeroy. It's a pleasure having you. You're an award-winning architect, urban planner, author, academic, and especially passionate about sustainability in our built environment. You work to raise awareness of the cultural role the built environment plays in society, and you hosted several architecture and urbanism TV series like Smart Cities, City Time Traveler, and Futuropolis. You're also the founder of interdisciplinary sustainable design and research firm Pomeroy Studio and sustainable educator and researcher Pomeroy Academy. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Before we go deeper into your designs and the concepts for sustainable architecture you've developed, could you start by telling me your story and why you care about sustainability?
Wow, big question to start off with. I think it's one of always wanting to be close to nature. When I was a kid, my mother and father had a really beautiful back garden with lots of greenery, lots of flowers and whatnot. And I used to take my mother's bed sheets and I would bring them down from the bedroom and I would create wigwam tents. And my mother used to go absolutely crazy on me for dirtying her bed sheets by creating these structures in the garden. That was my first foray into architecture, I guess, creating spaces. And then my father took me to St. Paul's Cathedral and he took me to the Whispering Gallery. And if you've been there, it's an amazing dome structure by Sir Christopher Wren. And he took me up against the wall and he whispered along the curvature of the wall, and I could hear on the other side what he was saying. I thought it was magic. And I thought, my goodness, how could this be? And he said, well, this guy called Sir Christopher Wren, he was an astronomer, he was an architect, he was a mathematician, he was a surveyor to the king. And I thought, wow, this sounds like a really cool job. I mean, to be bringing all of these elements together. And that's what laid the inkling of wanting to create something that is shaping space, that combines arts and sciences. And somewhere along the line, this whole notion of being able to do as much as possible with as little material as possible intrigued me. And when I was off at Canterbury School of Architecture and then Cambridge University, it was all about doing as much as possible in a frugal way. And that's what led me into doing what we're doing today. I mean, designing, shaping spaces, places that are very passive, but also applying technologies that will enhance the experience for the individual.
That's beautiful. So then you founded your own interdisciplinary studio. And what is Pomeroy Studio's mission?
I guess you could summarize the mission into 3 Ds. I think the first one is to distill the lessons from the past. I would say that many of the best lessons in history have laid the groundwork for many to do what they do today. And if you were to think of Darwin and this theory of evolution, I would argue that some of the best design ideas have already been created and they have stood the test of time. The reason why we have these beautiful heritage buildings is because they work and they've stood the test of time and they have been adaptively reused. So why not distill the essence, the lessons from the past in order to then inform the decisions that we take in the design of the present? And so it's that element of reinterpretation that informs the design works that we do, and then the ability to share that with a broader audience through broadcast media or my publications or my lectures. That element of dissemination, the third D, is what gets us out of bed in the morning. So distill, design, disseminate. These are the 3 Ds that underpin the rationale of why we exist as a studio and as an academy. And ultimately, it's about really going beyond this often archaic approach to sustainability, when we still get so caught up with this idea that sustainability is about social, economic, environmental principles, the triple bottom line. But I would argue that in this day and age, it's also about space, culture, and technology. So going from the triple bottom line to 6 pillars of sustainability.
I want to pick up that topic that you mentioned in the end, or also it's part of distilling lessons from the past. You wrote a book called Cities of Opportunities, Connecting Culture and Innovation. What do you believe is the key to successfully integrating these aspects into our cities of tomorrow?
Wow, that's a huge question. I think it's probably about, first of all, understanding that once upon a time, culture was innovation. So what I mean by that is if I look at St. Paul's Cathedral, right? There's my beautiful cathedral in my home city of London. St. Paul's Cathedral is a cultural landmark. But in its day, it was an incredibly innovative structure. When the people of London saw the plans, the blueprints of St. Paul's Cathedral with this dome, they thought, this is very European. It's not very English. They were up in arms. It was too innovative for them. And for me, what I find interesting is that the passage of time, one sees innovation become culture. And arguably, in this day and age, when we look at the climate crisis is making us innovate in a very green way. Tomorrow, that will become our culture. The lessons that we are going through today in reacting to the climate crisis, the innovations that we're taking, for instance, in carbon sinks and net zero developments, this will become the culture of the future. So I would argue that whilst we think of culture being very much about time-tested rituals, past traditions, art, architecture, literature, music, that's culture with a capital C. It is incredibly interlinked with this whole notion of what innovation is, which is about looking at new concepts to create new passages of thought and new processes and systems that are unlocking new values in art, architecture, literature, music, so on and so forth. And the best cities that have stood the test of time are understanding that these two sides can actually be interlinked. Amsterdam, Barcelona, London, In the East, I'm thinking Bangkok. In Indonesia, I'm thinking Bandung. These are cities that are able to blur the boundaries between the culture of heritage with also the innovation of young entrepreneurs to live side by side. And as long as the city is designed in a way that is flexible and adaptable to incoming ideas, that's when you can have this beautiful hybrid.
That's a super cool concept. Really like it. And talking about cities, you've also done some research on vertical urban theory and the sky courts and sky gardens as alternative social spaces. Can you go deeper into that?
Yeah, so my research at Cambridge University many years ago was based around how do people play or socially interact or relax in high density environments. I'm half English, half Malaysian. So growing up in London in the UK, in a very nice little quaint environment with a garden, I felt like I had greenery all around me. But when I used to visit relatives in Kuala Lumpur, a high density city with lots of high rise structures, I thought, where do people go to play? Where do people go to relax? If we are increasingly densifying our cities, where is our outlet for social interaction? When I think of the fact that 3% of the surface area of the earth are our cities, and yet 70% of our global population will be living in that small 3% of space, all of a sudden, you know that there's going to be a huge fight over space. And so the idea of a spatial replenishment for our social interactions is what effectively got me started on this journey. The journey to look at how alternative social spaces should be incorporated into high-rise structures. And ultimately, it then led to a question on density. Our perception of density is often driven to what we can see in front of us. If I thought about Paris and Haussmann's Paris, 8 to 10 stories of boulevards and beautiful courtyard-orientated development, I can look up, I can see the sky, it doesn't feel dense. And yet when I'm in Hong Kong, in a district called Tsim Sha Tsui, where you've got 20-story skyscrapers and I can't see the sky because it's all so tight, it feels very dense. And yet, this Haussmann's Paris is denser than 20-story Tsim Sha Tsui in Hong Kong. And it's all about the perceived density. It's because we can't see the sky. That's why we think it's so dense. So that led me on a journey to think about how sky courts, sky gardens can be an added element within our urban vocabulary to shape spaces that feel less dense, more socially inclusive. And when you're incorporating these pockets of space, you can then start thinking about alternative social uses. Ultimately, social uses that provide a physiological benefit, but also an environmental benefit. And the role of greenery in our cities will obviously mean that you're looking at its environmental properties of carbon sequestration, water retention, ambient temperature reduction. All of these greater environmental benefits means that our cities can also be healthier, along with the people that live within them.
Very interesting. What do you think about Singapore?
I think Singapore has taken a great leap in transitioning from being a garden city to a city and a garden. You're increasingly finding this place being filled with urban greenery, both on the horizontal plane, the vertical plane, the diagonal plane. I think that the symbiosis between landscape of turf and palm and shrubs and trees is sitting alongside the glass, the steel, the concrete that we often associate with cities. And I think as a nation, it's doing the right thing in respecting nature, trying to encourage biodiversity back into the city, and ultimately seeing the benefits of what the greenery can do. Singapore is naturally a very hot and humid place with temperatures ranging from 24 to 32 degrees centigrade, humidity levels of 80% to 100%. So it can be very uncomfortable. So the ability to incorporate greenery for its social benefits, to provide shade and shelter as well as a welcome respite on the eye from not looking at glass and concrete all the time, is certainly an enjoyable experience.
That's right. When I was in Singapore, I felt it was a very interesting vibe in the city, because on one hand, I was a tourist, so I didn't have to go to work during those days. But people were really at 12 o'clock, everybody was out going for lunch. And then at 1, they were going back. And on the other hand, it was 6 o'clock or so-ish. Everybody was in the park working out. I felt like it was a really conscious or efficient life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's an element of social programming that is, it still continues. What can I say? Ladina, I wish I could say it was different. People still go for lunch at 12 o'clock. People still go back to work at 1 o'clock. It feels very, very programmed. There isn't this sense of spontaneity. And I think this is something that is very typical of an environment that has needed to be organized very, very quickly. We need to bear in mind that it's only a matter of, well, since, how many years has it been? Slightly over 50 years of independence. And what we are seeing is a nation that was born out of a colonial setting. Singapore was a British colonial trading port. And then after independence, it had to reinvent itself as a city of services, a city of finance, a city that was generating microprocessors and chips. Ultimately, it had to find its new economic anchor for its own survival. And so Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister's vision, was to say, look, as long as you can work hard, you'll make a good living and the economy will grow. And that means having a very, very programmed way of living. It still happens today, but I do think that we're starting to relax a bit more. I think that the city has evolved culturally. Over the last 10 years, you're starting to see the National Gallery of Singapore take root in the City Hall building. We're seeing an incredible array of events that are adding to the social makeup of the place. But Rome wasn't created in a day, neither was Singapore. I think we still got a long way to go to make it a relaxed place that has a bit of spontaneity. I'm still waiting for that.
But I liked seeing that they were, on one hand, super efficient, but having nature so closely kind of brought them down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that having nature on your doorstep, or rather integrating the nature, has actually created a very healthy living environment. We did a master plan for the Singapore Sports Council. It's basically a very large 86-hectare sports precinct that includes the National Stadium. It's called Kallang Alive. And ultimately, it was the pilot to generate a greater interest in sport for the whole population. So having this sports district there to encourage people to get out and about and active was the catalyst for then minor mini parks to be incorporating active sporting elements to encourage people to step out into the great outdoors, put the mobile phone down, and just get active. And I think as a movement, it's gone incredibly well. I mean, I don't want to, not here to take credit for the master plan. I'm here to kind of say that we're part and parcel of a bigger vision of the government to get people away from sitting in their offices for too long, staring at their mobile phones, but actually getting a bit active, which is great.
Singapore is also a city with lots of water, and you wrote a book where you explore the ideas behind self-sustaining communities on water. Can you tell me more about these concepts and their impact on future urban planning?
Yeah, I wrote a book in 2016 called Pod Off Grid, and it was explorations in low energy waterborne communities. Now, this was off the back of a bit of research that we did on net zero development. Back in 2008, 2009, I designed the first zero carbon house in Asia called the Idea House. And it catalyzed a series of research projects that was bringing us to a vision for what net zero communities would look like in Asia. Um, I've always loved Venice. I've always been passionate about everything from the villas of Scamozzi to Palladio to just the weird and the wonderful. For instance, the two quarantine islands off the coast of Venice. Bizarre things, I know. And I struck up a really wonderful conversation with IUAV, the Istituto Università di Architettura di Venezia. Please forgive my terrible pronunciation there. But ultimately, they were willing to do a joint research project where we would share our knowledge about net zero development and they would share their knowledge about floating structures and the capacity to build floating environments. So over the course of 2 years, we ran a few studios with the university. We had a whole series of students creating their visions on water. And it was a wonderful collaboration where the professors at Venice and ourselves were contributing to enriching the lives of these students through an understanding of the two different subject matters coming together, which was then the basis of the book. And in the process, I then did a TV show called Futuropolis. This came around the time of my TV show on the evolution of Singapore. Over 50 years, how Singapore transitioned from a post-colonial independent city-state to a smart nation. And then the TV channel thought, okay, well, you brought us up to date. What is Singapore 50 years from now? What is Singapore looking like in 2065 or whatever? And that led to this show called Futuropolis, and part of that was looking at floating structures on the water. So it was just as well I wrote that book, because a lot of the research that we did in the book could then be translated or transposed over to the TV show.
Okay. And what was the biggest lesson you learned from this project?
How incredibly infallible and cataclysmic our world is in terms of climate change and rising sea levels. And the fact that 34, 35 mega cities of the world, which have over 10 million people, are all in flood risk locations, meaning that the idea of creating static boundaries, barricades, barriers to the water is not going to protect us. We need to be thinking more creatively about more diverse, dynamic solutions that could actually float. A classic example of how this has worked is the Banda Aceh tsunami, which came from Indonesia and completely decimated Indonesia. And the ripple effect of the tsunami was even felt in Maldives. And because of the structure of the Maldives stilted houses, some of the floors of these homes simply lifted up and then could settle back down onto the columns, onto the pillars that were already put into the water. And so it's simple technologies that are often working the best. And I think it was an interesting lesson to think about how some of our forefathers and foremother solutions in relation to dealing with water are actually providing the solutions for the future.
Has that influenced your design approach at Pomeroy Studio?
It has. I think that when it comes to waterborne development, we are passionate about creating both a combination of piered structures and floating structures. And so we're seeing this in the works that we do in the Philippines, also in Indonesia. We actually created a floating farm concept as well. So by creating a floating raft that is approximately 75 meters in diameter, we were able to create an urban farm on water that could generate enough root crops, vegetables, to feed 31,250 people. And this floating ring could also generate enough energy to power 600 homes. So the idea of being able to create a diverse Lego kit of parts that can be deployed onto the water, from the ability to live, to work, to play, but also feed, is something that we're really interested in.
And what was the biggest challenge of that project?
The biggest challenge of the project was definitely trying to get different ministries to decide who takes ownership. You see, the problem is when you have a multidisciplinary background where you're so used to thinking in a very joined up nature with master planners, landscape architects, interior designers, graphic designers, sustainability consultants. When you talk to ministries like the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Energy, they don't talk to each other. And when you've created a structure that appeals to a nation's interest in clean energy generation and food production to feed the people, they're happy to separate and take control, but they're not happy to come together to realize that this one giant ring could actually serve two ministries, two agencies.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. So you've also worked extensively on net zero projects. What strategies and technologies do you find most effective in achieving net zero in urban projects?
Basically, following what our ancestors were doing. Simple as that. I mean, I think that many of the best lessons of passive design have already been created by our predecessors. So I think it's all about understanding the culture of a place and the climate of a place. The starting point for all of our projects is a really rigorous climatic analysis that really takes into account temperature, airflow and wind direction, solar insolation, annual rainfall, before we then start to think about the other critical elements, the social elements, the spatial elements, the cultural elements, the technological elements, the economic elements. So starting with the climate and allowing us to then create a passive approach to the design that optimizes natural light, natural ventilation, and the sourcing of local materials. And we then take a very cultural rooted approach to understanding how the people of the past would use spaces and how that is adapted over time. And the practices of a people living or working or playing there should also influence the use of the energy and the water. So we go through a very rigorous approach of understanding what the day in the life of the individual is. What is it that gets people out of bed in the morning? What is their regime? And understanding and mapping the patterns of their flow through a space, through a building, using quantifiable measures, starts to give us a picture of how they are spending their energy and water. And so the combination of climate, shaping the building to be passive, optimizing natural light and natural ventilation, all of this is already driving down our consumption. But then refining that based on the patterns of usage further drives down consumption. And by that point, we can then start thinking about the active approaches, the passive to begin with, followed by the active. And that could be a range of different types of energy generation, clean energy generation. So in the case of our work in Sweden, we were looking at monocrystalline and polycrystalline and membrane cell technology. We were looking at wind turbine solutions. We were looking at CHP. We were looking at biomass. So often the combination of different types of clean energy was what drove us to then getting to a net zero position on buildings, whether that's in Europe or whether that's in the Middle East or even in Asia.
You just walk me through the entire design process for your sustainable projects. Can you go deeper into the details, the constructive part, like what innovative materials you've worked with that you had positive experience with?
Yeah, I think that it's always important to innovate, but innovate within reason. I mean, I think that a lot of innovations can take place in a controlled laboratory environment. And then sometimes you can then scale up from there. We are always open to new materials. So in the case of Sweden, we were using cross-laminated timber construction for 15 to 18 story structures, which is actually quite tall for cross-laminated timber. In Thailand, we were exploring the use of bamboo. In Singapore, we were using ocean plastics that were reconstituted, washed, crushed, molded, and used as an internal cladding material.
How's the internal climate with that plastic material on the walls?
It was actually very comfortable. I mean, we've got to bear in mind that this was a hermetically sealed retail store for an Asian salad chain. So this particular brand of salad cafe called Salad Stop, they wanted to really be the most sustainable fast food salad, so a healthy food brand. And what they wanted to do was see if they could get to a net zero position on their operation. And so what this meant was a wonderful journey with them to think about their entire operation, from the sourcing of their leafy vegetables, from the lettuce to tomatoes, where they were sourcing these things, through to the packaging, through to the tables and the chairs that they were using, through to the equipment, and then through to the interior of their store. And so, look, I'm not a chef, okay? I mean, I can cook, but that's not my expertise. They are the experts in creating amazing salads. But it was such a wonderful learning because they were teaching me about the salads while I was actually looking at how they were sourcing and the back process to get to that 1 kilogram of lettuce. And so it was a really interesting journey in circularity. And part and parcel of that overall systems map was the interior. And the cladding materials that we looked at were a range. We were looking at coconut husks. We were looking at reconstituted timber from waste timber from forests. We were looking at all sorts of different materials. But the one thing that they wanted to do was think about all of the plastics that are thrown away. So in Singapore, there's a lot of plastic waste, huge amount. We were looking at the ability to take ocean plastics, but also waste plastics from forks and spoons and other discarded material. And this would go through a process of First of all, washing, shredding, heating, molding into these plastic discs that could then be mounted as an interior cladding material to this soffit, which was very curved and quite beautiful. Looks like a scaly fish, if you will. And then it's a question of how do you take that to the next level? How can it be more than just a cladding material? How can it be a structural material? And so that's something that is currently being explored. The idea that you could actually have a structural integrity to this type of formation that could then be used as a load-bearing material.
It's super interesting also that some materials work really well in some spaces, like in a restaurant or sometimes even in a more industrial space. And some work really well to create this homey feeling and a nice microclimate for a home, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that one just needs to be very conscientious. At the end of the day, somebody is paying your bills. Somebody is employing you as a consultant to offer the right advice. It's not fair for me to be imposing my will on a client to kind of say, this looks good because I say so. At the end of the day, we're all individuals. We all have our loves. And we just want to educate. We want to take them on a journey. The starting point for us, though, is obviously the sustainability of the material and the ability to specify a low ecotoxicity, I think is very important. The ability to think about the travel distance of that particular product, the back process of the materials production also informs part and parcel of the consultancy process that we give our clients. So I would say that it's a very, very end-to-end method of hand-holding. I mean, I would say that sometimes I don't know whether I'm an architect or a therapist. I kind of enjoy it because I'm helping them through on this greener journey.
Yeah, really. As an architect, you sometimes feel like a therapist, but also an educator and everything at once.
You know it. I mean, Ladina, you are an architect in your own rights. You've got practice. I completely understand. I sympathize.
So how do you inspire your students in the academy to embrace sustainability in their careers?
I'm fortunate enough that often the students that come to us or even the employees, they are already 100% signed up to the Pomeroy ethos. I guess I wouldn't want to say that it's like a mantra, but I do think that people are doing the right thing and increasingly are doing the right thing. I guess it's not a difficult thing for us to attract talent. I think that we are in a fortunate position that we are leading by example. We do what we do because we have a passion for what we do, and the clients that come to us share our passion. We're all in it for the same common goal, which is to create a leaner, cleaner, greener built environment. And that naturally, like osmosis, spreads through the system. And if our students are able to come on board, learn a bit during the process, and then go on to great things and influence the system in the future, then we think that we've done our job. And that's why I like teaching at different levels. I mean, on the one hand, I teach on the Prince of Wales program, the business sustainability program at Cambridge University, which really is a remarkable executive program that takes place over 4 days and inspires leaders to make conscientious changes, transform their businesses, their corporations to do the right thing, through to master's students at Cambridge who are looking to shape the built environment, through to secondary school students who are even thinking about what to do with their lives. You know, I'm more than happy to talk to a kid who wants to create, products or go into finance or go into agriculture. But as long as they're getting it from a lens of the green agenda, I know that they're going to be doing something purposeful. So it doesn't really matter whether they're going to go into the built environment or not. If you can influence them from a young age to do the right thing that has purpose for people and planet, I think that's the most important.
And as architects, we love to experiment. So it must be interesting as well for you. You also have limited resources of people that work with you and things you can test. And if you have a few students that are interested in testing out or experimenting with other concepts and materials, it's very cool to.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we are not just a design studio, we're a research studio. So we often have one research project per year that is completely self-funded, and we have lots of willing collaborators that come in all shapes or forms. I mean, we've had the privilege and pleasure of working with very large corporations, but also complete city, states, and governments. It's a pleasure to be working, for instance, with the Slovak government, where we created a digital twin platform for them. Similarly, it's a privilege to be working for the Singapore government in the sports council activities that we did. So I think it's always important for us to evolve. And I would argue that to be able to substantiate design with an element of fact and reason is important in this day and age. I don't think we can be totally intuitive and subjective anymore. I think in this digitally driven, knowledge driven age, we need to be basing our design subjective assertions with a greater level of objectivity and fact and reason. And that's what I think makes us quite unique in being able to balance this creative vigor with an academic rigor. That's the balance that we try to hit.
What research project are you currently working on?
Well, it's the continuation of our digital twin. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was filming a TV show called Smart Cities, and the former Secretary of State of Slovakia was coming into to land on his journey on his plane, and before he landed, he was flicking through the TV channels, clearly bored, and he came across my TV show, and I was talking about smart cities and digital twins. And it was the catalyst to start thinking about how do you move from an analog world to a digital world? How do you transform the planning process and the construction process? And what I found curious about Slovakia was that the planning process was still caught up in the typical, let's get a series of plans, let's rubber stamp it, let's submit it. And it's a very archaic process. And what it meant was that you could end up having a long time for a planning decision to be made. But if you were to digitize, if you were to say that there is a standard form of submission, all of a sudden you've increased the capacity for planners to make a decision, and you're also getting a lot more planning permissions signed off digitally. And that actually catalyzes the building economy. And so we advise them, well, why stop with the built environment? Why not also think about the overall economy, whether it's relating to finance or agriculture or hospitality or retail or whatever, and start thinking about a more holistic system. And that led to the national digital twin strategy that we created for Slovakia. And that then led to the proof of concept of effectively creating a digital twin platform for the built environment industry. And so that's ongoing. It's been a privilege and pleasure to be working with the Slovak government. We're now doing the same in Oman and Saudi Arabia too.
Wow, I'm super excited to hear more of that. And I hope Switzerland will also be at that point at some point.
Oh, Let's hope, but you probably are doing it already, I'm sure.
Well, less than you'd expect. We still have to hand in paper plans and everything. We have like a digitalized system, but it's not where you'd expect it to be. Jason, I have one last question for you. In your opinion, how advanced is Singapore in sustainability, and what is your vision for its future?
I would say that Singapore is quite advanced in that it's doing the right things environmentally in terms of the increasing acknowledgement of a combination of passive and active approaches to sustainable design to drive down energy, water, and other resource consumption. The ability to green the landscape, to create more urban greenery, not just on the horizontal surfaces, but diagonal and vertical surfaces of buildings to try and drive down the negative effects of climate change. So all of these on the surface are great, environmentally speaking. Technology-wise, it's doing well in terms of digitization. It's doing well in terms of trying to find how apps and digital media can help us as citizens improve our daily lives, whether it's looking at our health screening data on an app or looking at our pensions or our taxes or even just ordering cars or shopping. Yeah, in the case of creating a one-stop app, Singapore is doing quite well in allowing people to connect digitally to each other as well as to the state. I guess my major question is around culture and the social aspects of how a local culture can be grown. I think Singapore is still trying to find itself in the world and understand the cultural identity of what makes Singapore Singapore. Having come from the UK, which has centuries of heritage and culture, when you are a young, youthful nation, it's very easy to seize upon a particular idea and stick to it. I think the ability to relax into what defines you as a culture is going to be important over the next decade or so. So I think that on the basis of assessing the sustainability of Singapore across our 6 pillars, I would say that it's doing very well technologically, it's doing very well economically, it's doing very well environmentally, it's doing very well spatially in terms of the role of sky calls and sky gardens to balance density. In terms of the social and cultural aspects, this is the work in progress, and I look forward to seeing that evolve over time.
Yeah, and you're putting your part as well into it. Thank you very much, Jason. It has been a pleasure talking to you and getting all your insights. If people want to follow your work, where can they find you?
They can follow me on www.pomeroystudio.sg for our design works. They can follow me on www.pomeroyacademy.sg for our research and education. For my broadcast media and books, you can follow me on www.jasonpomeroy.sg. And finally, on Instagram, it's Jason Pomeroy _ARC. That's ARCH.
Great. I will put those links as well in the description. A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Schipf. Thanks.